Hi, and welcome to the Two Texts podcast. I'm here with my co-host John Andrews, and my name is David Harvey. This is a podcast of two friends from two different countries, meeting every 2 weeks to talk about the Bible. Each week we pick one text to talk about, which invariably leads us to talking about two texts and often many more. This season we're taking a long, slow journey through the book of Acts to explore how the first Christians encountered the disruptive presence of the Holy Spirit. So, John, the last time we had a fascinating conversation about the gospel at some level being sort of defended by the city clerk in Acts chapter 19 because of how the gospel was being practiced by the early disciples, because they weren't doing illegal things. Yeah. And they weren't getting involved in fights that are not gospel fights. There was no legal recourse to actually prosecute them, which was a fascinating conversation, wasn't it?
Oh, I found it really. Again, for our listeners, sometimes you read through passages of the book of Acts and you just think, oh, that's just a piece of like information filler that we've got. You know, this clerk stands up, says a wee piece, all right, let's move on. But actually, again, as we've said over and over again, if a writer includes something like that, it's because there's some piece of detail in there that the writer is going, hey, pick up the breadcrumbs here. Don't miss this. And I think one of the glorious things that we see and we talked at length about was that the church's behavior almost empowered the city clerk to defend the church. Because there was nothing that they could pin a legal argument on. I disagree with the Christian worldview, disagree with the belief that Jesus is Lord, etc., etc. But actually, there was nothing legal or even religious in the blasphemous sense that they could pin on the Christians, and therefore, actually, case dismissed. Sort of thing. And we get this courageous clerk saying, hey, look, if you've got a legal problem, take it to the courts. If not, you all need to go home, and defends the church and diffuses a potentially destructive and catastrophic situation. I mean, if thousands of people are given the green light to go, then we could see Christians, we could see Gaius and Aristarchus and some of these people torn limb from limb. So you could end up with blood on the streets here. And this brilliant intervention from this city clerk and the wisdom and courage that he shows gives me encouragement that even people who don't agree with the worldview of Christianity, if we behave in a way that is aligned with the gospel, we give people like that no excuse to be against us, and also we give them every opportunity to actually legally support our right to believe what we believe. And I love that idea. And I think if any of our listeners have missed that podcast, it is definitely worth going back. Again, people may not agree with all our conclusions, but I think it empowers some serious conversation around issues of the 21st century church.
Without trying to sound like a preacher for a second, it strikes me that there's a fear-faith dynamic going on here. That at the core of this, the crowd are afraid. Right, that something has happened, which, you know, Demetrius and his fellow craftsmen have realized the gospel is a threat to us.
Yes,
and they're trying to create, as we often do, they're trying to trump up the level of threat when really it's an economic threat to them.
Yeah.
But like nobody really cares about that. You're in an open free market economy. You know, if you can't keep up, that's just tough. But if you can position their threat as a threat to our way of being, then all of a sudden people start to get involved in that. And I think that means the whole thing's operating in fear. And I was pondering that from your words from the last episode, this is where the church needs to be vigilant. Correct. That if we react in fear, it's so easy to end up getting caught into the very same trap, which is why the church is called to act in faith, which is why the church is called to keep trusting. And And I wonder if I can play a little bit with the text, John, I wonder if Luke's even trying to tell us this, right? That really what's wrong with this crowd is they have no faith, right? And they're loud, they're obnoxious, they're a threat, they could be violent. It's like, I'm sure you've said this to your children. I've said it to mine, that the problem with a lot of bullies is they're actually just afraid. And they just look very scary. They just sound very scary. But actually, it's not strength, it's fear that's motivating this. And I was thinking about how Paul doesn't actually go and speak to these people.
Yeah.
Right? In one sense, we see he wants to, but then he actually accepts that he's not open to. And then in the Greek, the city clerk offers us a couple of words that are really fascinating. He says, if there's anything further you want to bring up, this is verse 39, it must be settled in a legal assembly, right? Which is to imply this is not a legal assembly.
Yep.
Right? And then later in verse 41, he dismisses this assembly. Of course, what I think is really interesting is the Greek word for assembly is the word ecclesia,
Indeed.
which is the same word that we would translate as church elsewhere. Right? But then chapter 20, verse 1 begins, when the uproar has ended, Paul sent for, and now we get the disciples.
Yes.
And he starts to encourage them. Right? And the reason this triggered my thought was just a line, and as many of our listeners know, I've been pondering Willie Jennings' commentary on Acts throughout this long Acts series that we're in. And Jennings has this line, and he's just this commentary is controversial at points, but it's there's lines in it, John, which are so stunning. Here's one, right? About this passage. He says this: a crowd that gains faith will shrink in size and become a congregation.
Very good. Yeah.
And I was looking at this, and the city clerk says, this is not a legal assembly. Essentially, that's what he said. This is not a legal church. But then when the chaos stops, when the fear disappears, Paul pulls together a small group of Jesus followers, mathetes, disciples, and he encourages them. And it just struck me that this is the journey of the church. When the church reacts in fear and tries to play in the mob, it ceases to be a church. But when the church can step into faith, it may be that the mob dissipates. It may be that the crowd even dissipates. But what you're left with is a small group of people committed to Jesus who want to live out the gospel. And what Acts is telling us is that's how the world was turned upside down. It wasn't turned upside down by winning over riotous crowds. It was turned upside down by being committed to the apostles' teaching, fellowship, the breaking of bread, and to the prayers. And I just wonder if Luke's not being a little playful here with his use of the language of ecclesia, of pointing out, hey, readers, this is not the church. And the church shouldn't look like this. I mean, dismiss this and we can just delete it and we'll start a whole new podcast. But what do you think of that idea?
Oh, no, I love that. And again, that's the beauty of letting 19 and 20 flow together. There is a beautiful juxtaposition here. So you get this mob, uproar, almost chaotic, out of control situation. And I love the language, when the uproar had ended. So there's just that's just beautifully poetic and brilliant. When the uproar had ended, Paul called for or sent for the disciples and encouraged them, and obviously he says goodbye to them at this point before moving on. So you get this lovely, the very thing that the mob in fear is trying to eradicate. We've now got a community of faith, actually unmoved and still committed and still strong and still growing. And we've no idea what the numbers are here in terms of the disciples, how many or how few. But the fact that you get this lovely juxtaposition between a ravenous mob that doesn't have any centered, clear belief system, but is driven by fear. And then you get this group of disciples that have a sense of calling and clarity around a singular idea that Jesus is Lord, crucified and risen from the dead. And I love that. And again, we reflected last time on the last podcast on empire and church and how the church outlasted the empire. And this is why, David. This is why. Because actually, whether there's 100 disciples or 10 disciples, we don't know how many, but actually they're together. There's a sense of, you can play on the idea of calling there around even in that, but they're encouraged in the core message of the gospel, which is the thing that's going to always outlast the mob. The mob will eventually run out of energy. The mob will eventually, the uproar that the mob has created will eventually dissipate because it's being driven not by a sustainable idea, but by something that eventually will eat itself up, will run itself out. Whereas, as you say, a faith dynamic is only going in one direction, and that's a direction of growth and increase and influence, which of course, ironically and gloriously, this is almost a little picture of a bigger idea that's happening right in front of our eyes, that the roar of Rome is eventually going to dissipate, but the discipling and encouraging and the calling of the ecclesia is going to continue growing and advancing.
It reminds me, Margaret Mead has a quotation that I'm sure you've stumbled over at times. She says, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change the world." And then she says, "In fact, it's the only thing that ever has." And I love this. It came to mind just as you were saying that just there, because you have this contrast, don't you, of potentially 12,000 people. I mean, we don't know. We just know that there's space for that many people in this crowd. Yeah. Riotous crowd. Just, and the best that the government says to them is like, this is a mess. And then Paul sends for some disciples, and I love that line we've referenced already in Acts. The critique of the church is they're turning the world upside down. Right? Yeah. And you actually look at how they're turning the world upside down, and that's even why I think it's worth paying attention to Acts chapter 20, verse 4 and 5. He goes with Sopater and Secundus and Gaius and Timothy and Tychicus. It's this. Let me say this, and some people might hear this as an insult, but you know me well enough to know that it's not. This movement that we are talking about 2,000 years later, right, is so unbelievably small that people's individual names are memorable.
It's mentioned, right? Absolutely.
Like think about this. This is not because there are just millions of people here, but these people were particularly exceptional. Like these are the people. Right? Yeah. Like we're seeing the world change. We're seeing Western Europe be reached with the gospel as this Acts moves its way through there by a list of people that we can list, names that we can mention. Yeah. It's stunning, really, to think about it, isn't it?
No, right? It is. It's absolutely. And I love the fact. And again, we've reflected that when Luke includes bits of information like that, these aren't random. Why does he give us a list of these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people? 4 of them from the Macedonian region. So if you're looking at the map, that's sort of where Philippi is, and places like Thessalonica would sit within Macedonia. And in fact, you've got this, and then you've got 3 of them from the Asia, so across the sea, and you've got into that. So you've got this lovely sense of the influence of the gospel in different regions: Berea, Thessalonica, Derbe, the province of Asia. And we're just a few years in, right? So whatever the numbers were of the early church in terms of how many people are going to the church of Thessalonica, the point is that actually these names also reflect, number one, we're getting individual men named, which is very significant. We'll maybe come back to think about why that is. But also we're given from Berea, from Thessalonica, from Derbe, from the province of Asia. So Luke could have just said, Aristarchus, but he tells us where he's from. And actually, that's an indicator again of the influence of this gospel, this grassroots movement, this yeast in the dough stuff that's just infiltrating in a very, it seems, natural and in some cases dynamic and sometimes unassuming way. This gospel is just infiltrating Roman society. So the crowd, the roar of the crowd has died down, but we've got Christian communities in Berea, Thessalonica, Derbe, Asia, Philippi, potentially Athens, Corinth, of course. These are all in that. If you put a big blanket over the map, you're touching all of these areas. So something dynamic and amazing is happening, and it's happening through discipleship, encouragement, as you said, Apostles' Creed, teaching, prayer, fellowship, the core ideas that we build on day after day after day after day.
And I mean, just as a historical point, and put a little asterisk next to this because many scholars make a living arguing over this sort of stuff, but it's not uncommon. In fact, probably, well, let's just say a lot of scholars think that this is probably happening around about the winter of AD 57 into 58. So any of our listeners are interested just when this is happening, it's probably around about then. And so you've possibly got some sort of notion that, this is potentially, it's around about this time that Paul actually writes Romans.
Yes.
Right? I think that's kind of really interesting, actually, off the back of the conversation that we've just had, right?
Yeah.
That Paul takes this point off the back of this scenario to ponder and scratch out what many people consider to be one of the greatest pieces of theology ever written, and to Rome by no stretch. I mean, that's not in the text, obviously, but as I'm sure our listeners realize, scholars are often trying to work out, okay, when is this happening, and when is Paul writing his letters around these times? But I think but for our conversation, it feels worth mentioning. I know we don't always mention this stuff, but if there is a possibility that Paul's writing Rome at this point, it's really curious given the spread of the Roman Empire, of the church, of these names that you've just mentioned, plus the battle that he's just come from in Ephesus, and Ephesus really being one of the sort of outposts of the Roman emperor's influence in Eastern Asia, sort of thing. So, again, I mean, we don't necessarily need to do anything with that, but I think it's quite interesting that Paul comes from that, potentially does that.
Absolutely, and I think what's also fascinating, if our listeners remember the reading that we did, and we went into Acts chapter 20, you get that little sense of Paul wants to go to Syria because I think the ultimate goal is he's heading down to Jerusalem with an offering that he's collected from the churches in the Macedonian region for the Church of Jerusalem. And so you've got that sense which he wants to probably go to Syria and then on to Jerusalem, from maybe picking up the boat from Troas and sailing out of there and doing that. But of course, because of some issues of persecution, it says because of some Jews had plotted against him, he changes his decision. He goes back through Macedonia, probably to encourage the believers again. And I think it's interesting that this is probably in part why we're getting these names listed, because it seems random, doesn't it? Just suddenly you get a bunch of names that are there. Yes. But there's a lovely little reference to this, David, that I saw, which is just gorgeous, where when Paul writes to the church at Corinth, chapter 16, he says this: "Then when I arrive, I will give letters of introduction to the men you approve and send them with your gift to Jerusalem. It seems advisable for me to go also and they will accompany me. So there seems to be a lovely little backstory here, in even in the midst of this, that Paul has collected some offerings from the church in Macedonia, taken it, but what he's also asking for is people approved by those individual congregations to travel with him. So if the men listed here are connected to that conversation in Corinth, and these aren't just random men that are being mentioned, but these are men that already within the context of their local community have a measure of confidence and approval from that Christian community. And of course, when I read that list, I thought, oh, there's no women mentioned. But of course, if Paul is taking a major financial offering from the Macedonian churches all the way to Jerusalem, it makes sense that actually they're loading up with men for that journey, not necessarily wanting women on that journey for security reasons. Forgive me if that sounds in any way derogatory. It's not meant to, but I think it may explain why you've got only men listed if these men are helping with that offering. So they're not only from Macedonia and Asia, but these are people approved to help carry significant offering to the church at Jerusalem as well. And I think that's worth a mention within the context of that. Does that make sense as to why those names might be included?
Well, if I mean, it's fascinating, John, you're saying this, because even I wanted to interject for a second there, but if Paul is writing Romans at this point, of course, he does send a woman with the party to take the letter to Rome, and Phoebe seems to be the first reader of Romans. So that that's worth noting based on what you just said there.
Yeah.
And of course, these group of people appear to be people, so Gaius, for example, he gets mentioned in Romans chapter 16, who's from Corinth, baptized by Paul. He's also listed as the recipient of the third letter of John. And whether it's the same Gaius, of course, we don't know, but that's interesting. And so it seems that this Corinthian meetup, or this Greek meetup that we're referenced in Acts 20 verse 2, there's really some significant people come around Paul at this sort of time. And I think it's interesting as well that you're seeing this blend of the Jew and Gentile, the church coming together. So the thing that we've been struggling with so much of how the gospel sits outside of its Jewish boundaries, this list of names, again, is a hint towards the real embedding amongst cross-cultural boundaries of the church. These are the people that Paul is now trusting, and these are the people that the church knows these people. They are. Yeah. I wonder if that's part of the reason as well. They're listed, but just simply because they've traveled and they are now well known.
Indeed. And of course, there's a lovely little. You mentioned, some of the people we've already referred to there, but there's a lovely little extra link to Aristarchus in that he gets a couple more references throughout the New Testament. So we pick him up again as Paul's fellow prisoner in Colossians, which is really interesting. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, salutes you. So I love that he's gone all the way to the end with Paul. And then also when Paul writes to Philemon, again, and it's interesting in that Colossians.
It's a great list, this one. You got to read it.
Absolutely. Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, Luke, my fellow workers. So you get this fellow prisoner with Aristarchus and also fellow worker or fellow labor. I mean, and in Paul's estimation, that's high praise indeed. This sort of fellow worker language, which we've touched into before. I mean, this is serious. So what I love about some of these names is that they don't just appear and disappear. Some of these names travel a little bit for us in different contexts, not only in the book of Acts, but beyond into the writings of Paul. And we see sort of different beautiful references here that show a continuity in Paul's conversation.
Well, Well, I mean, I love the Philemon reference. I mean, my goodness, and maybe we should mention. I don't know if we've ever mentioned this, but I have this deep affinity to Philemon when I talk to you because it was really a conversation about Philemon that caused us to start this podcast all those years ago.
Yeah.
If you remember, we had a great chat one day on a call about Philemon, and at the end of the call, we're like, "Man, we should have recorded that call." and Two Texts was born shortly afterwards. So Philemon is important to us, but Mark, obviously, beautiful to see his name mentioned as a co-worker with Paul. Right? We've talked about this in this episode. You've written about this, but it's lovely. Aristarchus and Luke as co-workers. Well, here, notice in this, Paul was accompanied by Sopater and Aristarchus, but in verse 6, but we sailed from Philippi, right?
Yeah.
So Luke is, bear in mind, everybody, that Luke is with him here. So these are his friends he's talking about. These are people that he has gotten to know as well. Like we don't hear Luke directly referenced because he's the one writing, but here we see Paul knows they were all together. The companionship of the gospel is quite beautiful, isn't it?
It totally is, and I think it's worth reminding our listeners again, certainly reminding ourselves, that sometimes we do a tremendous disservice to Paul by presenting him as this lone ranger, I am alone, I am enough character, and yet there's enough clues, there's enough ideas both implicitly and explicitly expressed in the book of Acts, in the writings of Paul and others, that show this is the furthest thing from the truth. Paul is occasionally on his own, but rarely. And actually, he's surrounding himself with outstanding people who are helping him achieve the gospel, but he's helping them also grow and mature into Christ and serve him. And I think we got to keep reminding ourselves that Christianity in general is not an individual experience, though it absolutely reflects your individual experience with Jesus. But Christianity as a way, is a community idea. We are not meant to travel from Philippi to Troas. We're not meant to travel from, Troas to Jerusalem on our own. We are meant to travel together with people, and there's a reason for that. But also this idea then, let's flip it a little bit harder into purpose. There seems to be an argument and a consistent argument throughout the scriptures that it's actually, there's a sense in which I cannot fully achieve the purpose to which I've been called as an individual without learning to walk with Aristarchus and Gaius and Timothy and these beautiful people in my world. I need to learn to walk with others, because that is one of the key ways in which John Andrews is going to fulfill whatever purpose Jesus has put on his life. And I think it's important. We see the conversion of Saul in the book of Acts chapter 9. We spent a lot of time on it. And then Saul is immediately introduced to Ananias. He's not on his own. And then Barnabas takes a hold of him. And then he's introduced to the apostle. So you're getting even a dynamic, outstanding individual like Paul. You're getting constant references to connection to community, both at, as you said beautifully, at a friendship level, but also at a ministry and missional level. And I think, again, that must speak to us in the 21st century, that we are not called to walk alone, both at a purely following Jesus level and at a serving Jesus level.
And at the same time as all of that, you also, it just strikes me, John, yes to everything you said, but notice the complexities that they're navigating, right? And so I may be reading too much into this here, but so feel free to pull me back from the edge. So you've got these friends, but then they separate and head out to Troas separately. And I'm reading this, John, as the fact that we're actually navigating the tension that the church lives in of Jews and Gentiles, right? Now, please correct me if you think I'm wrong on this, but But this group of names appear to be Greek names.
Yep.
They head out ahead to Troas, but Paul waits back to celebrate Passover.
Yeah.
Right? So Passover is a 1-day feast,
Yeah.
followed by the festival of unleavened bread, which is a 7-day feast, and then of Sabbaths and so on and so forth. And then they leave after that. So I've read this as an assumption that the reason that Paul doesn't travel at this point is he's Jew, so he has a festival to be part of. But the others have chosen to go on ahead because they don't need to be part of that festival.
Yeah.
I mean, is that what you think is going on there? Or?
Oh no, I think that's there. I think that's definitely there. And I the fact that again, this lovely information that Luke gives us, where he literally tells us why, and you get this lovely we language. We sailed from Philippi after the festival of unleavened bread. So Paul is accompanied by some people there in the context of that. And I think that's certainly there. I think the other side as well, as a little addition to that, I think you could also have the sort of logistics issue. They're going ahead of Troas to prepare the sailing, which is quite a. If you look at the map, Troas all the way round to somewhere like Syria, it's quite a journey. Right across that sort of great sea, as it was called then. But I think that's absolutely there. And again, you get these little hints that if Paul is wanting to observe Passover as a follower of Jesus, he's not imposing that on Gentile believers who don't see the need. And again, if that is part of what is happening, you get, I mean, this is beautiful, really, that you've got Paul still holding on in the purest sense to his Jewishness without imposing that unnecessarily on Gentile believers, because, at one level, Passover has been fulfilled and superseded in Christ Jesus. But it's still, of course, Passover is still a historic event to be celebrated and enjoyed as a Jewish person. So if that's what's happening there, which, my goodness, there's nothing to suggest it isn't, then I think that's, again, a beautiful sense of sensitivity to both Jewish believers who want to hold on to Passover because there's no reason to let go of Passover because of the event that it represents, but also not imposing that on others.
And that's exactly what I love how you phrased that. It harks me back to the conversation from the last episode, but in a very different way, right? About identifying gospel from preference, identifying gospel from culture. Yep. And there is nothing to stop, and actually I want to say these two things. There's nothing to stop Paul, the Jew, celebrating Passover.
Absolutely.
This is part of the story of God's faithfulness. And even as Paul is a Christian Jew, it's the story of God's faithfulness worked out in and through Christ across history. I mean,
completely.
But then the flip side of it is, there's no need for cultural assimilation here.
That's true.
There's no need for the non-Jewish people to celebrate Passover.
Yeah.
Right? And I think this is where the church in the modern age gets in so much trouble, that we either are rejecting things from a Jewish culture, or we're trying to make them Gentile, which is also offensive. And I love the fact that here we have the early church just, potentially just navigating this with full respect of each other, of saying, we do this, you do that. That's absolutely fine, and in no tension with our confession of Jesus as Lord. Yes. And there's a part of me feels like, what a beautiful prayer even for the church, that that these men went on ahead and waited for us.
It's great, isn't it?
They remained, they abided in patience for us. Like would that we would all just be a little more patient with each other and our cultures and our ideas and our ways of being that do not cause any stress or tension with the gospel.
Beautiful.
So that's it for this episode. We know that there's always more to explore, and we encourage you to dive into the text and do that. If you liked this episode, we'd really appreciate it if you rated, reviewed, or shared it. We also appreciate all of our listeners who financially support the show, sharing the weight of producing this podcast. If you'd like to support the show, visit twotexts.com. But that is all for now. So until next time, from John and I, goodbye.